thank you to Moritz and Aaron and HotPETs and everyone else who is a part of that to invite me and have me here. I really appreciate it. I'm a long time sort of fan of pets and the work you all are doing, but my first ever time being here. So feeling pretty honored. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be a very good, okay, this is great. As far as the sideshow goes from the technical work you're doing, I'm not going to be I'm not going to visually fulfill you, but I have one or two slides that I'm going to show, mostly because I too much traveling. But I guess to start off with here, I want to thank you all for doing work that you maybe don't realize that you are doing, which is supporting human rights and increasing human rights all over the world. I don't know if you start doing the work that you're doing thinking about that at all, but I'm very appreciative of a large number of you all that are doing that. So that is really slide 1 of 2. That was for a second. I don't know if anybody's playing Pokemon Go or not. Probably not in this room that much, but I definitely have set up a profile on my phone to play a little bit, so I've been thinking about it a lot. So I wanted to start off with that thank you, and then a very quick sort of intro of who I am and how I got here. And then I think what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you some stories of some people that I think whose human rights have been. I think we just stop. Yeah. This is distracting me. Thank you though, man. That was a good effort. So tell you some stories, highlight some technologies that I think are really important, and then tell you some themes, just as Roger was saying, that have been really important to us that we've developed to help figure out what technologies and what efforts are worth supporting. I'm hopefully not going to talk for a very long time because I really want you to be able to ask me anything that you want to, whether it's related to the talk that I presented or specific technologies, the Open Technology Fund, or just anything in this field. So I'm going to start with me. About 10, 15 years ago, I was sort of taught by a lot of good mentors how to be a software developer, and I got involved in security in the late 90s and wireless networks. Ultimately, just got really disenfranchised and didn't feel really good about doing it for banks and other big companies, and got involved with an organization called Indie Media in the early 2000s and building radio stations all over the Americas. And started sort of identifying as more of a sort of a public interest software developer or hacker rather than someone who was just doing code for anything else. That led me to Washington, D.C. actually, and around the 2000s or mid 2000s, working for an organization called the Open Technology Institute at New America. And then during the Arab Revolutions, I got excited about helping folks that were farther away and got pulled into Al Jazeera, where I'll talk a little bit about that later. But part of my job was to do technical investigations, be a part of the journalist team, and then the other half of it was to try to increase the security and privacy of our both sources and journalists in the field. Did that for a little bit, and then ultimately just got really fed up with just the sort of the state of play and the technology that was out there to solve those challenges, and was asked to help create this thing called the Open Technology Fund in 2012, and I've been doing that for the last 4 years. So I said about what we're going to do here. I guess I've got a couple questions I think I want to ask you all first, and I've already used a little bit of jargon: public interest technologist, human rights technologist. It's not going to be as jargony as some of the technical talks, but if you've got a question, I say an acronym or anything, just raise your hand or like shout it out. Be very informal. Feel like you can interrupt me. I do that enough myself, and I'll try to break down what it is that you didn't understand. But just as a real quick show of hands, how many of you all have heard of the phrase public interest technology before? Yeah, okay, good. This is what I have some ideas about you in the room, and I wanted to like validate or break those things down. And then of those like 5, maybe 6 people that raise your hands, how many of you would say that you're a public interest technologist? Okay, so about the same. Yeah, about the same. Okay, and then what about human rights technology? Has anybody heard this phrase used before, human rights technology? About the same, but different hands. This is good. And then as far as a human rights technologist, anybody? A little bit smaller, minus 2 or 3 hands, right? Okay, thank you. Now, so the reason why I bring this up is because like this is sort of a new thing, right? It's like, is this not just a technologist, not just a software developer, not just a cryptographer, but sort of where your motivations are. And so one of the things that I have this assumption about you all in the room is how much more motivated you are for like public interest in human rights, rather than just like sort of the technology itself, or privacy is sort of an ideal. And I shouldn't have that. I should be working harder to get more of you to raise your hand so that when I come here as just a guest next year, someone else asks that question, there's more hands in the air. Thank you for that. So I'm going to come back to what Open Technology Fund is. But first, how many of you have heard of Open Technology Fund? Oh, wow. How many of you are getting supported by the Open Technology Fund or have been supported by the Open Technology Fund? What about partners or collaborators? Wow, gives me goosebumps. This is why I can't play poker with the short sleeve shirt, because whenever I get excited or have a good hand or a bad hand, everyone can see it. Well, that makes me, I'm a little bit glowing right now. Y'all, like, that's cool. I didn't realize so many of you all were in the room. And this is just the cost of, and I'll get to this later, of sort of what happened with OTF very recently is there's a lot of people I don't know that I really wish I knew more of, that are in rooms like this that just as happens when you start doing more work. Okay, so OTF, we started in 2012. We are predominantly supported by the U.S. government. We receive, we've had a really crazy budget. On one end, it's been like $3 million. Another year, we got $12.75 million. Most of that comes through this high-level remit of free expression, guided by Article 19, which is the Declaration of Human Rights, stating everyone has the right to free expression, free speech, freedom of thought. And then a little bit further down, there's this very American-centric idea of internet freedom that's become a much bigger than American-centric idea of where those freedoms should be protected and supported online and on the internet and other communication mediums. And that's sort of where it came to pass as far as OTF's existence. In 2012, they realized that as far as technologically goes, they weren't doing enough to sort of reach out into communities like this and make it really easy and approachable for an individual or groups to sort of get support for the really good ideas that were increasing free expression. And so OTF came to pass as a more approachable funder for these projects. And we focus on technology-centric efforts that are first and foremost on increasing more unfettered access to the internet, but also very much related to trying to stop repressive surveillance and repressive privacy invasions, blackouts, all kinds of really interesting stuff, and then awareness programs that help make the tools and technologies that you're creating or the research that you're doing more publicly available, but mostly tech-centric efforts. So again, we started in 2012, and we really believe we've got a set of ideals and principles that really guide our work, and that's partly because we just don't know. The landscape is changing so quickly, and if you're more interested in sort of what we believe beyond just that everyone has a right to speak freely without any repressive censorship or surveillance, check out our website. You can see our mission, our ideals. You can see all the projects we supported there as well. We try really hard to be as transparent and accountable through that as we can be, so you can see almost everyone we funded, unless there is some sort of privacy concern that's significant. So just some numbers. At this point, we have over 200 different fellows and projects we've supported in the last 4 years. And some just need $5,000 to go travel somewhere, or $100 to travel somewhere, an event. And then others, such as Tor, we give almost $1 million a year to. We started off having to beg 12 very trusting souls to take our money in 2012, and had to really convince them that it was a good idea. And now we get about 100 to 150 applications every 2 months. So we've got at this point, over a couple thousand applications, and it's become a thing where we had to spend a lot of time following you to pivoting to a thing of where so much comes to us that sort of reviewing applications in our review process is sort of our biggest way of learning now, which is sort of interesting. We started off with maybe a few 100,000 to millions, a couple million people that were making use of technologies that we'd say were internet freedom technologies or human rights technologies to gain access or increase their privacy and security online. And now I think we've got something like over 1 billion, going on 2 billion people making use of technologies that OTF and or our partnering funders are supporting, which is pretty daunting and impressive, but also cool. And we've spent about $30 to $40 million, about $35 million in the last 4 years. So that's OTF by the numbers. So if you have any questions about that, I bring that up and totally willing to answer anything I can or know about in the question section. There's lots to just behind the scenes of OTF that I'm just going to skip over right now. So this next section, again, I'm going to tell some stories. I got about four stories and sort of accompanying projects that I'm going to frame why I think human rights technology as a sort of broader context for the privacy enhancing technology that you all are doing are incredibly important, at least to my day-to-day, and I think to those next 2 billion, 3 billion people that are going to be coming online in the next few years. So I'm going to tell a story. Now, just to be really clear, like there's some projects here that I'm not going to talk about, for example, Tor, partly because we all know it's amazing. I don't think I need to tell you all how awesome Tor is and why it's important to this community of whatnot, and it gets talked about a lot. So I'm going to talk about some other really popular projects as well, but and I'm also trying to ground these stories in a set of themes I want to introduce to you all at the end that are really important to us and I hope you can think about when you're choosing which projects you work on moving forward. So the first is an Iranian, and these are based on real people, but I'm not going to use any real names. I'm going to try to like keep the story part where I'm talking about the actual persona, the person, pretty light, just to protect privacy. But I'm also happy to give a lot more details if you want to come up to me afterwards and ask about a specific story. So I pardon for that. So the first is an Iranian woman is self-hosting in an Iranian virtual VPS in Iran, and she's doing a lot of documentation of information controls or sort of what's happening on the network within Iran as far as policy things. So what the legal regimes are doing to try to influence what they can and cannot track and block and whatnot. And she wants to upgrade her, for a couple different good reasons, she wants to upgrade her hosting solution to be HTTPS. And part of that is to protect the privacy of where she and when she's submitting and what she's submitting, and the others for the people that are visiting her website. One of the challenges that she is bumping into is it costs money, it requires a bit of knowledge, and it takes some time to do these things. Now the time and knowledge part isn't a limitation for her. She knows how to do it. She's got the time to do it. She's committed to do it. But the fact that it costs money is actually a bit of a problem in Iran until pretty recently. Most of the certificate issuers are US or European based, and they have sanctions that don't allow her to use her money to actually purchase a certificate. And this is a real problem. The solution here, at least for her, was, get someone else to purchase it, which sort of wasn't the nicest thing. Wanted to be able to do it herself. And then, of course, Let's Encrypt coming up pretty recently. How many people know of Let's Encrypt? Awesome. Right? This is an easy. I'm starting with the easy ones first. So that's hopefully you'll come across. So Let's Encrypt in this case, and this is going to be a theme on top. It takes a thing that has been sort of a real market-driven problem in a lot of ways for a really long time, and they automated the crap out of it. They made it free, and now they're I think the number 3 biggest issuer of public-facing certificates on the planet, and they did that in like 6 months, 8 months, or something like that. Really, and I think Seth from EFF is here. I don't know where he's at. But if he's here, you should find him and bother him more about Let's Encrypt. But this is one of those things where it didn't really. They are doing a lot, but like on the model of how important this is for Turkish bloggers right now, folks that are also self-hosting while that country continues to slide. The fact that it's so easy for them to get certificates, and not even that there's tools to automate the implementation process for their servers is. I'm getting goosebumps again because of the number of stories we get back. And this isn't a project that we're supporting. And I should say some of these projects we're not supporting directly, but I think are really big contributors to this. And if we're not supporting, we should be supporting, in this case, some of these projects. But we get a lot of emails about how like this is the boring stuff that should be happening to increase human rights rather than sort of creating a brand new thing. So I wanted to share that one first. The next is related, and this isn't quite a persona on a person, but it involves a whole lot of people that are really troubled, and I'll get to this sort of personally for me in a later story. A very large instant messaging app, the largest in the world, wants to upgrade its transport layer protocol. And it looks at TLS in the last 2 years of I'm glad to see these bugs come out, but it looks at TLS, it looks at SSL, and it's sort of like, oh, some liability there. What's going to happen if like this messaging service that's being used by both Americans and Europeans, but also has a really high adoption rate, the highest adoption rate in Egypt, in a lot of other countries that have unfortunate repressive regimes when it comes to free expression, privacy, and surveillance. And what they decided to do is sort of enumerate these challenges. They say, well, TLS was developed in the 90s. The first spec, I think, came out in like 99, TLS 1.0. It was definitely made for a world that doesn't exist today. And it's grown over time and it's iterated. But it's definitely got a very large protocol, large specification rather, that translates to an implementation attack service if you want to try to implement the whole specification. And I'm going to say this is a con in this case, but being managed by IETF means it's slow to iterate. It's developed by a committee, and it can. There are positives there for all of those folks. I was just at the IETF meeting in Berlin, and I think there are some positives. But in this case, it's proving hard to sort of iterate quick enough to keep up both with the concerns and the failures before, but also the environment today. So what did they do? In this case, we're talking about WhatsApp. Well, they decided to use their own, not their own, but a completely different one, an open source protocol called the Noise Protocol Framework, which is sort of confusing. And if you don't know about, anybody heard of that one? The Noise Protocol, a little bit less. Okay, so you can see this is the trend, hopefully. So the Noise Protocol Framework is a guy by Trevor Perrin who's here, so you should go talk to him some more. You find him. And I don't know enough to talk any more about it than what I'm going to say, but the idea being that it's a TLS-like protocol, and I don't want to say that it's a drop-in replacement, but it allows folks that have different motivations to have an alternative. And it's a simpler, more modern protocol. It's got a higher security cryptography, as I understand it, as a non-cryptographer, so someone can kick me if I'm wrong about that later. And it also has sort of specified more, the specification has more guarantees for deniability and identity hiding. And it's also faster and more scalable. So if you're talking about out of the box something that needs to support 1 billion people, and you don't have to like figure out how to retweak something that already has a lot of other scaling issues, it's a good alternative. So that's one. Okay, now I'm going to get back to individual people. In this case, several, but I'm thinking of one person in particular, a well-known Chinese human rights lawyer wants to do some research on a pretty serious human rights investigation that's making global headlines. And they're based in mainland China. How do they go about doing that? They're 55-ish years old. They're not the most technical person in the world, and they don't. You can't just go download Tor, for example. It's a harder solution for them to get involved in it. In this case, Deutsche Welle, the BBC, the New York Times, Guardian, a lot of your major Western sort of English first language sites that have Chinese native sites, those Chinese language sites are completely banned in those countries, in China. And that's just what it is. Now they have their own English version sites. Typically that front page is unbanned, but stories just sort of don't show up when you search for them, or that you have a link that someone shared you and it was there for them, but it's not there for you, or it's not there for them anymore either. And this is sort of a common thing that just happens in China. So what we're pointing to here is the challenges are very impressive DPI, deep packet inspection, within the Chinese Great Firewall. The heuristics mechanisms are ever improving, as in things that they don't even, the unknown knowns or the known unknowns and known whatever it is that phrase is, like the things that start generating traffic raise alarms to where different things start getting flagged for the human sensors, and it's just incredibly it's incredible and it's horrible, but how quickly they can go about removing things in different mediums, whether it's a WhatsApp message stream, WeChat, or a website, a URL. The selective content filtering is in like the ability to say that the New York Times is available on the front page, but that this embedded URL is not, or like specific content within URLs is not available. The sort of downgrading attacks of taking something that is HTTPS and then sort of refusing to give that connection, forcing the HTTP on a grand scale are all very present. The old whack-a-mole of blocking DNS, or with DNS blocking domains and IP addresses, is able to happen quicker and faster and smarter than ever before. And they have all these great little mechanisms to, test to see, is that a Tor connection? Is that a VPN connection? Is this like all these things to figure out how to block these things? So this one 50-ish-year-old guy's got all these things stacked up against when all he wants to do is just check the New York Times. And then on top of that, until I would say recently, most of the VPN tools, the proxy tools, were not very usable and or hard to come by. Now that is changing very, very quickly, and it's awesome how quickly it's changing. But they're still not as easy as just going to the website or running a browser extension or something like that. So the solution right now, which is pretty interesting, is this one called sort of collateral freedom / domain fronting. And I know this doesn't, at the start, if any of you know of it, sort of seem like a privacy enhancing technology, but it is. Anybody heard of this one? You all are awesome.
It was presented at PETS last year.
Oh, of course, right. So these are all the returnees. And I don't see David or David Fifield here, but he was probably the one that presented. Okay, yeah, so David presented it. You should talk more to him if you've got more questions about that, and that's awesome. One of our folks that we support as well. So the idea here, for those who don't know, and I'll try to keep it short, is you've got this situation where the collateral damage of blocking websites in China, increasingly Iran and other countries, is significant economically. As in, there are so many people in China for purely economic reasons running their own businesses that need access to Cloudflare or Google or Amazon Web Services or any of these other sort of big international frameworks, that to block them would cause not just social upheaval, like blocking Facebook's social network, but actually economic upheaval. So they call this collateral freedom. Like, the collateral damage means that there's this collateral freedom of these people who want to make use of these services, that they're these unblocked sites. And then on top of that, they mostly offer pretty easily, affordably, or by default, HTTPS connections. And this is where it becomes a privacy enhancing technology aspect for me, in that it's not just that you can't block Amazon.com or AWS.Amazon.com. It's that by default, HTTPS.AWS.Amazon.com is available, and therefore you've got some privacy properties included with doing this. There's two specific projects here that I want to point out, and the first one I already did, which is this one Meek, which is really great because it's sort of tool agnostic. It's a library that I think of as sort of extensible and portable for other tools, whether you're a proprietary VPN seller or you're an open source proxy tool, multi-hop onion routing tool like Tor, for example. You can drop in something like Meek, set up your own accounts on these different services, and all of a sudden get these properties of domain fronting and collateral freedom. In this case, you can route everything through it, or you can use it as a discovery to find out, like, what's that first IP address that they haven't blocked yet that's currently available. More questions, ask some other folks that raise their hands to hear more about that. And the other is this project called Great Fire, which has taken a completely different track. And this is where it veers a little bit away from privacy enhancing technologies and more about an access. How do you use this to just literally open the door for the person who, in our case study, is trying to find out more global information about the human rights violation, or someone who just wants to go check out the cat videos and go to YouTube and see like what their aunt and uncle are doing in Chicago. And in this case, they've created a way to mirror websites, a set of tools and scripts to just mirror any website, put it on an Amazon server or a caching server, and then create a new link for that, and then disseminate that really easily through a browser extension. So you're not getting the multi-hop proxy, you're not getting like the on privacy protection, but you are getting a tool that increases access much easier. Okay, so we got one more story. How's everyone doing? Yeah, okay, a few thumbs up. A lot of people not looking at their laptops. which is great. Hey, some more. Okay. So the next one is, this one's super personal for me. This one is, and I've said this one before, so I'm sorry for those who maybe have heard it, but in this case, it's another sort of Arab Revolution story. I alluded to that earlier. So when I took on this job in 2010, 2011 at Al Jazeera, I didn't realize how both difficult and easy at the same time it was going to be. The difficulties were, the hardest job I've ever had. You've got sources in the field who send you a text message and call you on the phone. And every time you get one of those text messages and on the phone, you're just like, a little part of you just is like, oh. Because especially if the message that they just left you or the phone call they sent you was something that you knew was newsworthy. Because you were just like, oh, well, who else just saw that? And so my first job was to figure out tools and technologies that would help increase the safety for these people and our journalists. And I don't know how many of you remember, that was difficult in like 2010, 2011 for your average person who didn't have any technological mind at all. And the result was I would get a text message, or mostly my colleagues rather than I would get a text message or a phone call. I'd hear about this, and then we wouldn't hear from them again. And the scale of what was happening to these journalist sources, which we all know about now, has become public knowledge. Was some of them were fleeing because they knew that they had access to something that was putting their family or themselves in danger. They were getting arrested, detained, tortured, and some killed. And a completely other story that doesn't have anything to do with me, but when I came into this job, what I find is a little bit lighter heart, as in no one getting tortured, detained, or killed that we know of. But when I took this job, I went and spent some time in Vietnam and had some conversations with some Vietnamese activists who had this sort of lighthearted, sort of, oh, it's just the way it is, no harm done sort of story, where it was, when we first started doing our activism work, these tails would these intelligence officers or local police would just start following us around. They ask us all these questions. Hey, who's that you were talking to? Who's that? Where were you at the other night? And just, and they sort of almost became friendly because they knew who these people were. These people knew a whole lot about them, and they would just sort of expect them there. And then one day they just literally stopped showing up. And the way they were framing the story is like, oh, they sort of missed their tails, like these people they had developed a relationship with, who they'd spent so much time with over the last like 2-3 years, and they were gone. And what there's a common theme here is, and they were asking us, to validate their assumptions of why they were gone. And of course, this room and now with a lot of disclosures, we know exactly what was going on. We know the capabilities of small and large countries when it comes to surveillance of unencrypted messages. So on the first story, the reason why these sources were disappearing was because they were sending plain text messages, unencrypted phone conversations, and it was really easy for them to be targeted and dealt with by those regimes. And in the case of the Vietnamese, it was really easy to just stop. It was obviously like no longer economical to follow them around all day because they had their phone tracking information. They could read their text messages. They could listen to their voice conversations. And so they would target them, and that would be it. And so coming back to the challenges there, end-to-end encryption on mobile devices at the time just didn't exist, actually, with the exception of you. Some of you are going to know where I'm going, and it's another big one, so this will be an easy one. And this was an early version of TextSecure by Whisper Systems at the time. And the same was true for the Vietnamese. As soon as they started using TextSecure, this is before we met them, guess who came back around? Their old friends. It was like literally within a week after they all started using TextSecure back in like 2011, 2010. All their friends come back and everyone's like, well, what's this? They're asking the same questions, but not really asking them about this tool that they're using. And partly it's because the people that are following them, they don't really understand at this time even, like there wasn't an understanding that like encryption was happening yet, like it is as part of the public discourse. And only 5 years since. But at the time, that was about as usable as it got. But before that was just not an option, end-to-end encryption on a phone. And then if we were honest, and we're still honest, like end-to-end encryption on a computer is not as good as it could. But going back 4 or 5 years, it was also very difficult. Like I think this status quo would have been Enigmail with Thunderbird, which is fine for probably almost everyone in this room or a lot of people in the room. But you all aren't the most important people to be considering when what is usable and what is easy. So in this case, of course, Signal's precursor, text secure, red phone, and ultimately now just Signal doing it all is the technology that we're highlighting here as how useful it's been for human rights purposes, for people that are really on the far end of the spectrum of getting repressed. And I don't need to talk about the advance. I think everyone knows Signal, and of course WhatsApp. I mean, is anybody not? I don't want to do that because I want to call you out. So if you don't know what Signal or the Signal protocol that's being used in WhatsApp, now you've got if you count all the other implementation, you got over 2 billion people making use of a thing. And of course, why is that massively positive? It's normalized encryption on the line, for one thing. It's not just Tor. I think you've got a lot of encryption happening beyond just HTTPS, making it very, very, very easy for some new activists with a new social ideal to not be persecuted and singled out in a way that it was really easy for them to be in just 4 or 5 years ago. So I just wanted to quickly say, again, some other notable projects, because these are just chosen to make some points that I'm going to make here in a second. I already said Tor project, and I'm not endorsing necessarily that I think that these are amazing projects. I'm just saying I think they fit the criteria of privacy-enhancing technologies that have a history of increasing human rights, or are going to. And hopefully you all will get involved with them at some point. So you've got Tor project, CryptoCat, Push Secure, N+1sec, OTR version 4. You've got Amino, Briar, and the Bramble protocol, Clatter, Mesh Communication, Magic Folder, Cubes, Tails, Subgraph, Copperhead OS. All of these are either dealing directly with encryption or doing things to increase privacy in their own way. And I think if you have thoughts on any of those, come ask me, and I'm happy to share more. How you feeling?
Great.
Yeah? I'll try to go through this next part really quickly and then leave a lot for questions. So this is the theme section of like stuff that I find is really important, helps me like figure out which of these projects are right and which ones are important, and ultimately to keep me grounded in what I think is most important in the work that we do. And the first and foremost, and I see a few of you smiling because I know who you are and how you think, and you smiled at a couple of things that I've said. But that is think first and foremost about the people that you're hoping to affect. And think about them the most and never stop thinking about them. And this is, sort of a tenet for co-design and co-development when you're doing something. It's not just good enough to have a good idea and then prototype it and then hope that it's going to be relevant for a group of people anymore. I don't know if it was ever a really good idea to do it to begin with, but it's now too easy to not. Like it's too easy to just reach out to a group, find out like what they think about a thing. And in particular, when you're talking about human rights technology, they're not just users, they're like the people, they're people. And they are, most of the people in this room, going to make some broad demographic assertions, are not going to be the ones most advantaged or affected by the things that you do well or the things that you do wrong. And that's going to be a whole other group of people that are probably not represented widely here. So don't forget about that. And if you're ever looking for funding, most funders are thinking this way now. So someone's going to remind you along the way, no matter how good your idea is going to be. And I just want to point out too that for these people, the challenges for them are so much more acute. And what I mean by that is because they're so on the farther side of the spectrum of what they know. When they know something failed, they didn't really know that it failed until a much later thing at the line. And the adversaries here are much more advanced as far as the space between them and the adversaries that they're working with. I might not say that like the Zimbabwe government is as advanced as the Vietnamese or the Chinese or the American, but the space between the Zimbabwe government's capabilities now with off-the-shelf like hacky team sort of things that are now available for a government that doesn't have a lot of money to the average citizen in Zimbabwe, is huge, bigger than it's ever been in the last maybe 10, 15 years since this technology to surveil oppressively and censor oppressively has become available. So the costs are much greater if you get it wrong. And so because of that, you just think about who you're trying to help and don't just stop at thinking about them. Try to figure out how to make them a part of the design process of the architectures you're developing. And even better yet, make them part of the development process so that they're there along the way. And if you can't, have a good reason why you can't, because there are some out there. The next point I want to talk about is this. I don't. Does anybody else think in like geometric shapes when you're thinking about ideas, like squares, circles, triangles? Yeah, things like that. Okay. Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about triangles, and one triangle in particular. Thanks to a couple of people in the audience who've let me soundboard this off them in the last few days. But in this case, I wish I had. I'm sorry I don't have a picture. You shouldn't talk about geometric shapes and not have a picture. But in this one, it's a triangle of things that are really important when we're ever thinking about whether a technology is worth supporting within the context of human right technology. And at a very high level, it's power, it's rights, power, and people. And I know that sounds like, well, whatever, but let me break it down in a little bit deeper. So in this case, the rights for this conference and like the room in the context of what we're talking about is privacy. That's the right to privacy. And in this case, let's go technologically on power and think about architecture first, and then think of, say, like centralized versus decentralized. So like this is like a technological architecture that can shift power. And it has a direct effect to power. And then if you go to the other corner, and some of you that have been around for longer will probably have like, well, this is a thing. I know that this is, and tell me if it is. And then the other is people, and in technological terms, again, we think about scale. And it's not just like scale to like 7 billion people. It might be you only need to affect like 10 people's lives, and you need to do it really well. And so that's why that is a higher level thing of people rather than sort of like numbers of people. So let's just take a couple of examples, right? So Signal, for example. Where does it fit on that triangle, right? So when it comes to rights, well, it's definitely increasing encrypted communication and the privacy of people in a way that very few other projects were doing. Was it doing it in a novel or like the most advanced way that we know? No. Well, so behind the scenes, as far as like supporting asynchronous communication, yes. But as far as like deniability and like, knowledge of keys and other things like that, it's not all the way on that, but it's definitely over there. And as far as people, is it a protocol that scales to billions of people? Well, yes. So we've not really seen anything like that in instant messaging before. So it fits over here. Now, what about power? Well, so it's if we use my example of Arch and centralization versus decentralization, well, it's a centralized tool. And it's definitely centralizing power around like Google, push service and Apple's push service and the Open Whisper server, and then of course WhatsApp. It's all Facebook. So it's not really shifting the power in architecture terms all that much. So it actually fits like over here. It's very useful on sort of. And the reason why I think about that is because, like, in my view of the world, at least, I want a balance of those three things on the triangle. So if we put all of our eggs in a basket, we're not really shifting power to the people we care a lot about. Now, another example that's sort of more new is this project called IPFS, Interplanetary File System. Anybody? Cool. This is a fun one. You should look this one up. So IPFS is a server. Well, hopefully, a serverless, especially if they finish the JavaScript implementation fully, a serverless distributed file system built on, it's got BitTorrent behind the scene of it. It's got all kinds of good stuff. I'm going to stop right there. But they've got a prototype called Orbit, which is a chat app. So I'm going to compare Orbit to Signal in this case. So in this case, not really any encryption on top of the app at all outside of an HTTPS session. So not doing a whole lot on privacy. Now you look at power, the fact that it's server free, and it can be booted up in a JavaScript or a browser extension and doesn't have a centralized server except for the one that offers up that JavaScript, that's really doing something for power dynamics there. And then you look at the other side of people, and it can theoretically scale pretty far. So that's an interesting one, sort of the other side of the another side of the triangle. So I just wanted to point that out as like a thing we think a lot about. And then it's shortening up. The old versus new. Let's just compare, say, Let's Encrypt versus the noise protocol framework. You've got Let's Encrypt, which is taking an old thing that needs to be done better, and it's scaling it up like crazy and automating the crap out of it, and it's keeping it around. You've got something like noise, which is saying, well, TLS 1.3, maybe that'll answer our problems, but we're not going to wait around for it. So we're just going to presume it doesn't exist. We're going to create a new thing. We're constantly trying to balance those things out as well, and like have people prove to us the case for why they chose an old versus new solution. The same is true for like standards and protocols. IETF versus posting your thing on GitHub, or learning and sharing traditional education versus like open peer learning, and I think a lot of where you all sit on both sides. And then the last two things, first thing is like open source everything. There's just no excuse for it. And I don't have to say that to this crowd, so I'm not going to go into like the advantages and benefits of it, but you'd just be surprised how many people apply to the Open Technology Fund and want like a proprietary license for their intellectual property. And we're just like, are you crazy? It's just not, it's not what we are. And it's not what we believe in. So, I think there's a lot of advantages there. If you want to go toe-to-toe with me on that, I'm happy to talk about it. And then I finally want to say, OTF isn't just about supporting things that aren't through the traditional sort of academic peer review process. We got like 30, 40 papers at this point that we're responsible for supporting people to publish through conferences like PETs, USNICS, and other academic places, and we love that. And I just want to like really give a nod to everyone out there who's doing that work of sticking in that space from theoretical to practical, and not necessarily getting into the implementation and giving yourself that like sort of satisfaction. Maybe you're not into it. Because like every one of these projects that I mentioned, we're talking about trying to solve stuff that are 2 to 3 years out, but are problems of the day. These papers they all have a paper or 5 that are the basis for what they're doing that were written 5, 10 years ago. And I just want to acknowledge and say thank you for that as well. And then I'm going to stop right there, very hard cut, and say thank you again for supporting human rights. And I really appreciate your work. I love following what you all are doing, and I'm looking forward to getting more from you in the future. And any questions?